Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a time when becoming a doctor wasn't exactly a dream job. It was more like a nightmare wrapped in optimism. Imagine this. You're standing in the dim candlelight of a medieval cottage, shadows dancing ominously on mud-packed walls, air thick with the smell of stale sweat and questionable herbs. You're clutching your brand new bag of primitive medical tools, heart pounding with both excitement and pure dread. After all, you've decided to become a healer in the Middle Ages, which, spoiler alert, means you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, leave a comment below telling me your location and what time it is there right now. It fascinates me how far these bedtime stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The journey to becoming a medieval doctor doesn't exactly start in a lecture hall, or even in a clean, well-lit classroom. Instead, you begin apprenticing under a physician whose credentials are, let's say, dubious at best. Right away, reality hits like a plague-carrying rat. You won't find glamorous surgeries, meticulous anatomy charts, or cutting-edge research here. Instead, your first lesson is about recognizing the imbalance of humors from your patient's complexion. Basically, if they're too pale, too flushed, too sweaty, or too dry, your best guess is as good as science gets. As a newly minted apprentice, your first task might involve mixing questionable ointments. You carefully stir a viscous brown paste made from ingredients you'd rather not identify, while your mentor reassures you, yes, crocodile dung really does cure that rash. You secretly doubt it, but medieval logic is as shaky as the floorboards beneath your feet. This is your introduction to medical practice, trusting that something disgusting and probably toxic can actually help a patient. But it's not just the ingredients making you second-guess your life choices. There's also the uncomfortable awareness that medical education is patchy at best. Historians still argue whether medieval medical knowledge truly advanced from ancient Greek and Roman teachings, or if it stalled, stagnated, or even slid backward. Honestly, you'd believe the latter, especially when your textbook tells you garlic worn around your neck wards off disease. It might scare off your friends, sure, but probably won't do much against the plague. Your mentor enthusiastically hands you a wooden stick covered with wax and instructs you to prod at a wound gently. It dawns on you hygiene isn't exactly priority number one here. Forget gloves, sterilization, or even basic soap. Germs are still centuries away from discovery. You're essentially doing battlefield surgery in a peasant's kitchen, with tools cleaned mostly by wiping them on your already filthy apron. So yeah, infection control is not your specialty nor anyone else's. As days turn to weeks, you realize medieval patients aren't exactly forgiving either. If your patient recovers, you might be rewarded with a few copper coins, maybe a loaf of stale bread. But if things go south, and let's face it, they often do, you'd better be quick on your feet. Angry family members are just as likely to chase you out of town with pitchforks and torches as they are to thank you for your noble attempts. Healing is risky business, both medically and personally, making job security a hilarious fantasy. Speaking of fantasies, your own dreams of fame and fortune crumble as you learn that medieval society ranks doctors somewhere between village blacksmith and wandering minstrel. Even worse, doctors are often viewed with suspicion or outright contempt. Villagers whisper behind your back, convinced you dabble in dark arts, since your treatments seem more like magic tricks gone wrong than legitimate medicine. Seriously, you can't win. Heal someone, you're suspicious. Fail to heal them, you're incompetent. And let's not forget, if you're really unfortunate, you'll find yourself summoned to treat royalty. Initially, this sounds like an honor, until you realize your royal patient will completely ignore your medical advice, because, well, they are royal. They firmly believe their noble blood alone grants immunity from disease, poison, and possibly gravity. You gently suggest they stop eating rich, fatty meats for every meal, only to receive a royal glare that could freeze boiling water. At least peasants pretend to listen. By now, you're wondering why anyone bothered becoming a medieval doctor at all. If you still hold romantic notions of ancient medical wisdom and heroic healers battling disease, medieval life quickly crushes those dreams. Instead, you spend your days desperately mixing herbs, dodging accusations of sorcery, and mostly guessing your way through diagnosis. Education is scarce, equipment even scarcer, and gratitude nearly non-existent. Yet despite the harsh reality, there's a strange, stubborn dignity in your pursuit. You might doubt your treatments, question your own skills, and occasionally consider running away to join a band of traveling minstrels, because at least nobody expects them to cure leprosy. But still, you persist. You become weirdly fond of your jars of questionable ingredients, protective over your collection of rusty instruments, and even a little proud of the ridiculous pointy hat you have to wear. After all, if medieval medicine can't heal bodies reliably, at least it provides endless opportunities for dark comedy. Ultimately, choosing the medieval doctor's life means embracing uncertainty, danger, and disappointment alongside just enough laughter to keep you from despair. You accept your fate, knowing you'll probably never be thanked, admired, or even particularly successful. But hey, at least you'll have endless material for future bedtime stories, assuming you survive long enough to tell them. You find yourself standing beneath a starlit sky, your neck craned upward in silent desperation. A medieval doctor, it turns out, spends almost as much time staring at the heavens as treating actual patients, because astrology, not anatomy, is the bedrock of your practice. You're not merely a physician. You're part astronomer, part fortune teller, and mostly confused. Your textbooks confidently declare that each star and planet exerts precise control over every aspect of the human body. Venus governs your kidneys, Mercury holds sway over your brain, and Jupiter, apparently, is the master of your liver. Who knew your internal organs had a celestial manager? Tonight, you've been summoned urgently. A wealthy merchant's son lies feverish, his skin flushed, breathing shallow. You step into the sick room, its air thick with incense intended to disguise the scent of illness, though mostly it just makes the room smell like burnt herbs and desperation. As you approach the young man, you realize it's time to consult your most trusted medical advisor, your astrology chart. With practiced solemnity, you spread the parchment across a table, cluttered with dried herbs and various questionable ointments. You squint at the diagrams, pretending to know exactly what you're looking at, even though deep down you suspect it might be an elaborate cosmic joke. You trace the alignment of stars and planets, doing your best to look wise, thoughtful, perhaps even mystical, because if nothing else, your dramatic performance must reassure the family hovering nervously nearby. Historians still argue whether medieval doctors truly believed astrology was medically effective, or simply a convenient way to shift blame when their cures inevitably failed. Secretly, you suspect the latter, but in public, you swear by the stars. When Jupiter enters a certain constellation, your patient's liver, you solemnly declare, is at risk. If Saturn moves unpredictably, expect joint pain. If Mars decides to misbehave, expect inflammation and possibly some kind of embarrassing rash. This system is scientifically dubious at best, but on the bright side, at least it gives you plenty of excuses when things don't go according to plan. Your patient coughs weakly, bringing your attention back to reality, or at least medieval reality. You glance again at your chart, noticing Mars has drifted slightly out of alignment. This, you announce confidently, explains the young man's fever. Ignoring the more likely explanation that he caught something nasty while wandering the filthy streets, you prescribe a careful regimen of herbal teas, brewed under specific moon phases, and a diet rich in bitter greens. Also, just for good measure, you advise he carry a small gemstone blessed under a full moon. You know, science. Of course, this entire process is about as effective as hoping a rabbit's foot will ward off thunderstorms. But hey, hope springs eternal in medieval medicine. Besides, if your patient recovers, you'll credit the stars and your unparalleled astrological skill. If not, well, clearly the heavens were displeased. Perhaps the merchant failed to properly observe fasting rituals. Or maybe the gemstone wasn't blessed under exactly the right phase of the moon. It's medieval medicine's greatest loophole, and you're grateful for it. At this point, a modern observer like yourself, comfortably lounging in bed, listening to this story, might wonder why anyone tolerated this celestial nonsense. The truth is, medieval people genuinely believed the universe operated according to precise mystical patterns. The stars didn't merely suggest outcomes, they dictated them. To question astrology openly would be like questioning gravity today. It just wasn't done. So here you are, playing along, reading the stars, and hoping nobody notices you're basically guessing. Sometimes, though, your astrological advice borders on the utterly bizarre. A patient complains of headaches? Well, Mercury might be grumpy today. Better soothe it by prescribing a poultice made from crushed snails, because naturally, snails represent Mercury's quicksilver nature. Got indigestion? Obviously, the moon is misaligned. Eat boiled cabbage, avoid goat meat, and wear silver jewelry until further notice. And if you've got a cough, blame the constellation Gemini, because twins obviously cause sore throats. You often wonder if medieval astrologers created these rules by throwing darts blindfolded at random objects and constellations. It would explain a lot. Despite your skepticism, you're required to follow these celestial rules religiously. If your patient dies, it's because fate, dictated by distant stars, decreed it. But if your patient lives well, then you're hailed as a medical genius, a master of cosmic secrets. People shower you with coins, gratitude, and invitations to extravagant feasts you're secretly wary of attending, since medieval banquet hygiene is a separate horror story. Still, astrology occasionally offers surprising moments of success, though probably coincidental. You recall a young woman plagued with insomnia. You advised her, based entirely on Venus's position, to place lavender beneath her pillow. Miraculously, or perhaps just luckily, she finally slept through the night. Suddenly, everyone wants your advice on bedroom lavender placement, and your astrological prowess becomes legend. You accept praise humbly, knowing full well your medical career is built on guesswork, superstition, and sheer dumb luck. Yet, oddly enough, there's something comforting in letting the stars shoulder the responsibility of diagnosis and treatment. After all, medieval life is harsh, unpredictable, and overwhelmingly uncertain. In a world where plague, famine, and war are daily threats, maybe it's not so crazy to think the universe has a grand plan, even if that plan seems borderline insane. Astrology might not cure diseases, but at least it gives your patients hope. Sometimes, hope matters more than accuracy. As dawn breaks, you finally roll up your astrological chart, satisfied that you've done your best, or at least medieval best, to heal the merchant's son. Tomorrow, you'll do it all again, staring at the night sky, guessing wildly, and hoping no one calls your bluff. In medieval medicine, you're less healer, more hopeful gambler, placing bets on planetary alignments, lucky stones, and herbal teas. It's a messy, confusing, occasionally hilarious job. But hey, it beats digging ditches or cleaning stables. With one last glance upward, you wonder briefly if future doctors will someday laugh at your astrological treatments, shaking their heads at the absurdity. Probably, you think with a smile, but until then, Jupiter better keep your liver healthy. After all, you might need it for tomorrow's questionable prescriptions. You stand in the shadowy backroom of your makeshift medieval clinic, eyeing the jar on your shelf with a mixture of respect and revulsion. Inside, dozens of sleek, hungry leeches squirm against each other, eager for their next meal. Welcome to medieval medicine's most famous and perhaps most misunderstood tool. That's right, bloodletting. In the Middle Ages, there's no aspirin, no antibiotics, no sterile syringes, just you, a sharp blade, and a jar full of little blood-sucking assistants. Today, you've been summoned to the village blacksmith, a burly fellow with arms thicker than most medieval textbooks. He lies on a straw-stuffed mattress, flushed and groaning. His wife insists he's suffering from excess blood, which, strangely, is considered a legitimate diagnosis in your time. As you unpack your tools, she watches nervously, clutching a sprig of garlic and muttering prayers just loud enough for you to hear. Clearly, faith in your skills only goes so far. Historians still argue whether bloodletting actually provided relief, acted as a placebo, or simply weakened patients already fighting illness. But in medieval practice, nobody questions it. Blood, after all, is considered one of the four humors alongside yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. When these humors get imbalanced, medieval wisdom dictates the body must be rebalanced by letting out some excess fluid. It sounds logical until you realize the process involves intentionally slicing open veins or arteries, or your preferred method, applying hungry leeches to sensitive skin. You select a particularly plump leech from your jar, watching it squirm enthusiastically. Secretly, you're impressed by how eager these creatures are, even though your patients rarely share your enthusiasm. You place the leech delicately onto the blacksmith's flushed arm. It immediately latches on, its tiny teeth sinking gently into the skin. The blacksmith winces and glares at you accusingly. You offer a sheepish smile. This will help. You say, though honestly, your confidence in medieval medical theory isn't exactly rock solid. As the leech feeds, you reflect on just how central bloodletting is to your practice. It's your go-to cure for nearly every ailment imaginable. Headaches, fevers, indigestion, melancholy, and even heartbreak. You've never quite figured out how removing blood could possibly cure emotional distress, but medieval medicine isn't big on subtlety or nuance. Got a problem? Bleed it out. Problem persists? Well, clearly you haven't bled enough. Sometimes your technique involves a small incision, quick and clean, but mostly you rely on your slimy friends. Leeches, for all their creepiness, are surprisingly effective bloodletting instruments. They latch firmly, draw blood steadily, and conveniently detach themselves when full like nature's own medieval vending machine. Afterward, you gently collect them, place them back into the jar, and admire their satisfied wriggling. They're reusable too, which pleases your medieval sense of frugality, even if hygiene is a concept still centuries away. But using leeches isn't without problems. One memorable patient, a particularly wealthy merchant's wife, panicked halfway through treatment and tried to shake the leeches off, flinging several across the room. You spent an awkward hour crawling around the floor, rescuing your valuable assistants from under furniture, all while trying to maintain dignity in front of her very judgmental maid. Medieval medicine isn't always glamorous, actually. It almost never is, but at least it's rarely boring. Of course, Hygiene during bloodletting is practically non-existent. Your instruments, usually blades, cupping glasses, and leeches, receive nothing more than a quick wipe down between patients. The idea that dirty tools might spread disease simply hasn't occurred to anyone yet. Germ theory won't appear for another 5 centuries, and until then, you just hope your filthy hands in recycled leeches don't cause more harm than good. Still, the survival rate for medieval doctors themselves isn't stellar either, so at least you're all equally miserable together. Interestingly, medieval physicians actually debated the best times for bloodletting. Believe it or not, astrological calendars dictate precise days when bleeding patients is most beneficial or dangerously risky. Bleeding during the full moon might relieve migraines, but woe to the doctor who attempts bloodletting when Saturn's in retrograde. Such reckless actions supposedly doom patients to prolonged illness or even madness. You're never entirely sure about these celestial guidelines, but considering the stakes, you generally play alone. In truth, some medieval bloodletting practices actually survive into modern medicine, though certainly more refined. Today, medical leeches are occasionally used to stimulate blood flow during reconstructive surgeries. Of course, medieval, you has no idea of this future relevance. You're just happy your leeches are doing their jobs quietly, efficiently, and without complaint. Frankly, they're your favorite co-workers. They don't gossip, ask difficult questions, or demand payment. They just eat, detach, and rest, ready for another day's strange work. Your blacksmith patient finally begins to look pale and faint, a good sign in medieval terms. You gently remove the satiated leeches, carefully placing them back into their jar. The blacksmith's wife stares anxiously at her husband's now significantly paler face, clearly wondering if this was a good idea. You confidently reassure her he's balanced now. Privately, you're just relieved he didn't faint completely. Patients collapsing mid-treatment always look bad on your resume. And speaking of resumes, medieval doctors have another peculiar issue: reputation. Because bloodletting is so ubiquitous, skill in applying leeches can make or break your career. Clumsy bleeding leads to rumors of incompetence or worse, accusations of sorcery. You never quite figured out how incompetence translates to witchcraft, but medieval logic rarely makes sense. So you handle each treatment with exaggerated care, hoping your patient won't gossip afterward about your shaky hands or nervous laughter. Yet, despite all its absurdity, bloodletting remains the cornerstone of medieval medicine, at least until science evolves. Until then, you'll dutifully bleed, leech, and repeat, praying secretly that your guesses don't end in tragedy. You might not understand exactly why bloodletting works, or if it truly works at all, but for now, it's the best tool you've got. And hey, at least your leeches seem happy. You pack up your tools, give a polite nod to your patient's wife, and step out into the evening air. Tomorrow, there will surely be another patient, another ailment, another jar of squirming helpers. Medieval medicine is messy, confusing, and occasionally gross, but at least it's predictable. As you walk away, you silently thank your leeches for their service, because let's face it, without them, you'd probably be unemployed or chased out of town by angry villagers. Standing in your dimly lit medieval quarters, you reluctantly slip on the outfit that, in theory, should make you appear both wise and imposing, but actually makes you feel like you're attending history's weirdest masquerade ball. Welcome to the baffling world of medieval physician fashion, a curious blend of medical superstition, theatrical flair, and deeply questionable taste. At the moment, you're pulling on your heavy leather cloak, complete with a matching wide-brimmed hat, because apparently no medieval healer is complete without traumatic headgear. But the piece de resistance is undoubtedly the infamous plague mask along. Beak-like contraption, designed to protect you from disease by filling it with herbs, spices, and flowers. Today, you've chosen lavender and dried roses, hoping they'll at least mask the stench of medieval streets, even if they do absolutely nothing to prevent infection. You glance at your reflection in a small, cracked mirror, looking less like a respected healer and more like a confused bird attending a funeral. Historians still argue whether medieval plague doctors genuinely believed the masks offered protection, or if the beak was more symbolic, perhaps representing vigilance or caution. Secretly, you suspect the real explanation involves a medieval prankster who managed to convince everyone that dressing like a crow was medically sound. Still, appearances matter, and your patients feel oddly reassured by your strange attire. Today, you're visiting a family whose father has fallen ill. They stare nervously as you step through their doorway, your shadow casting an eerie silhouette on the walls. One child clings tightly to his mother, whispering anxiously, "Mama, is that a monster?" Honestly, you understand his confusion. This peculiar costume doesn't just terrify children. Adults are equally wary. Medieval villagers frequently cross themselves as you pass, unsure whether you're here to cure disease or announce their impending doom. You politely ignore their superstitions, confident, or at least pretending to be confident, that your bizarre ensemble inspires trust and authority. After all, in medieval medicine, style often trumps substance. Ironically, your dramatic appearance sometimes convinces people you're better equipped than you actually are. Patients marvel at your long cloak, elaborate gloves, and mysterious mask, believing these strange garments grant special protective powers. If only they knew your real protection amounted to dried flowers and blind optimism. You approach your patient, a carpenter lying feverish on a straw mattress, his wife nervously hovering nearby. Through muffled words distorted by your beak mask, you ask about symptoms, straining to hear through the thick leather. Communicating clearly in this contraption is nearly impossible, so conversations quickly become a medieval game of telephone with predictably mixed results. Despite your noble intentions, your mask sometimes becomes unintentionally comedic. Once, during a home visit, you leaned forward too far, knocking over an entire shelf of homemade remedies. Another time, your beak mask became tangled in a patient's laundry drying overhead, causing a frantic and embarrassing struggle that villagers still giggle about behind your back. Medieval dignity, it turns out, is surprisingly fragile. But awkwardness aside, there's an oddly practical aspect to your bizarre attire. Thick gloves shield your hands from questionable substances. Cloaks protect your clothing from dirt, and wide-brimmed hats help you navigate filthy, medieval streets without unpleasant surprises landing on your head, because medieval pigeons have even worse hygiene than medieval villagers. Still, you can't shake the feeling your outfit is less medical necessity, more elaborate medieval cosplay. Occasionally, your costume even inspires imitation, though rarely flattering. Local charlatans sometimes don similar attire to trick villagers into believing they're skilled healers. Your reputation takes a hit whenever someone dressed suspiciously like you prescribes, a cure involving crushed earthworms or chance under a full moon. Then again, considering your own questionable cures, perhaps medieval medicine isn't exactly the realm of experts anyway. Yet, despite its absurdity, your distinctive clothing helps establish your identity as a healer. People quickly learn to spot you from a distance, your silhouette unmistakable. Children might run screaming, dogs might bark aggressively, and horses occasionally panic, but at least everyone knows who you are. Recognition, however peculiar, is still recognition. But medieval medical fashion doesn't stop at plague masks and strange hats. Physicians often carry ceremonial staffs, vials filled with mysterious liquids, and even tiny pouches of gemstones reputed to ward off illness. Your mentor once handed you a small pouch of crushed emerald dust, solemnly claiming it prevented infection. You're still unsure if he was serious or simply having fun at your expense, but just in case, you keep it close. After all, medieval medicine is full of surprises, even for its practitioners. And speaking of gemstones, medieval doctors sometimes recommended carrying amulets, rings, or pendants inscribed with mystical symbols. These supposedly offered protection from evil spirits, bad humors, and presumably, common sense. You once suggested to a nobleman that he wear an amulet shaped like a unicorn horn, and to your astonishment, he not only took your advice, but claimed immediate relief. You learned quickly, never underestimate the medieval power of suggestion or unicorn horns. As you finish examining your patient, you carefully remove your mask to speak more clearly, causing the carpenter's family to visibly relax. You assure them you'll prepare an herbal remedy, though privately you have little faith in its effectiveness. Still, your appearance alone seems reassuring, which perhaps matters most. Stepping outside, you inhale deeply, grateful for fresh air. Your mask's interior has become decidedly unpleasant after prolonged use. You glance around the village, noting villagers quietly watching you from windows and doorways. Some wave cautiously, others quickly hide. Your presence might inspire respect, fear, amusement, or some confusing combination. But at least nobody mistakes you for the local blacksmith or baker. You're unmistakably a medieval healer bird mask and all. Yet, despite the absurdity, the medieval plague doctor's costume endures today as a symbol of historical medical quackery and misguided attempts at disease prevention. You sometimes wonder if future generations will look back at your bizarre attire and laugh, or if they'll admire your bravery, stepping fearlessly into danger clad in leather, herbs, and misplaced confidence. Either way, tonight you'll hang your costume carefully in the corner, reminding yourself that in medieval medicine, appearances matter almost as much as actual healing. Tomorrow, you'll wear it again, enduring muffled conversations, awkward mishaps, and suspicious glances, all part of the peculiar charm of medieval doctorhood. As you settle into bed, reflecting on your unusual career choice, you smile wryly. Sure, medieval physician fashion might be ridiculous, but at least it gives future historians something amusing to talk about. And perhaps, centuries later, your strange mask will still spark curiosity, wonder, and more than a few puzzled laughs. Not exactly the legacy you imagined, but hey, at least it's memorable. You walk through the muddy village square, a smell of stale ale and livestock thick in the air, only to be stopped by a man waving a bottle filled with something suspiciously bubbly and very green. Cures gout, fevers, and heartbreak, he proclaims with a toothy grin and theatrical bow. Around him, peasants gather eagerly, dropping coins into his outstretched hand. You pause, jaw tightening, as you recognize the village's favorite quack again. This man has no training, no medical texts, no plague mask, thankfully, and certainly no grasp of humoral theory. What he does have is a loud voice, dazzling confidence, and a flair for showmanship. And unfortunately, he's making more money in a day than you earn treating 6 patients and applying 3 leeches. In the Middle Ages, charisma often trumps competence, and you're constantly reminded that skill in healing doesn't always translate to success. You've spent years memorizing Galenic theory, studying Latin medical manuscripts, and learning which herbs cause vomiting versus, well, more vomiting, but quacks? They just show up with snake oil and a sales pitch. Historians still argue whether these wandering peddlers actually believed in their cures, or were fully aware of the scam. Either way, they thrive because in a world with so few answers, people cling to the loudest promise of hope. The problem isn't just competition, it's confusion. Many villagers can't tell the difference between a licensed physician, a wise woman, a monk with a jar of ointment, or a man who sells potions brewed from frog toenails and good vibes. Medicine is a messy, unregulated marketplace where everyone's opinion carries weight. And worse, if someone's sheep stops limping after eating your competitor's strange soup, word spreads faster than the plague. You recall one patient, an elderly farmer with a persistent cough, whom you treated diligently for weeks with herbal infusions and carefully timed bleedings. Then, one morning, you arrived to find him sipping something thick and shimmering, handed to him by a traveling physician who claimed to have studied with the Moors. The farmer swore it worked overnight. You tried not to take it personally, but let's be honest, it stung more than a leech on your own ankle. Even more frustrating, some of these quacks are genuinely persuasive. They toss around exotic terms like dragon root and mercurial spirit, wear shiny rings, and speak of distant lands you're not entirely sure exist. The villagers eat it up. Once, a man claimed his sun-dried scarab salve could reverse aging. Did it work? Of course not. But did he sell out his entire stock by midday? Absolutely. And here you are sober, tired, and faintly covered in someone else's rash wondering what you did wrong. Perhaps you need a gimmick, maybe a hat made from owl feathers or a mysterious accent. Something to draw crowds, turn heads, and convince the people that you, not Mr. Snake Oil, are the real deal. But of course, you're burdened with ethics. You know the liver doesn't respond to bat wing powder, and that crushed sapphire does more for your finances than your fever. You believe medicine should be based, however shakily, on knowledge, not theater, which puts you at a serious disadvantage in a society that confuses performance with precision. This isn't just about pride, though. It's about consequences. You've seen the results of quackery. Infected wounds packed with dirt, bellies bloated from poisonous elixirs, even deaths blamed on evil spirits when a quack told a family to burn sage instead of treating a simple infection. You've tried to intervene, to educate, to correct, but it's like throwing a bucket of clean water into the ocean. One afternoon, you attend a gathering where several healers are showing off their wares. One demonstrates how his potion makes frogs dance, yes, dance. The crowd is mesmerized. You clear your throat, attempting to explain that the frog is clearly tied to a string, but you're drowned out by applause. Someone hands the man a basket of eggs in gratitude. You, meanwhile, are left explaining why your antiseptic salve doesn't smell like roses. Even the local nobility isn't immune to these persuasive peddlers. A baron you once treated with a carefully crafted poultice later hired a miracle man to rid him of melancholy by burying him up to the neck in goose feathers. You weren't invited to that follow-up session. And yet, you can't entirely hate these quacks. Well, maybe a little. But deep down, you understand their appeal. In a world of mystery and misery, people crave answers. Real medicine is slow, uncertain, and sometimes unpleasant. But quackery is easy. It promises fast fixes, magical cures, and above all, a sense of control. You can't blame people for wanting that. Still, it wears you down. Day after day, you treat patients who trust a shiny bottle more than your years of study. You lose sleep over infections that could have been prevented. You pour effort into treatments that are ignored, second-guessed, or undone by the village's latest charismatic charlatan. And yet, you return, because even if no one thanks you, even if you're constantly out-earned by someone in a feathered cape selling elixirs made from fish eyeballs and prayer, you know the work matters. You patch wounds, ease pain, and offer comfort, even if it's not wrapped in glitter. As the sun sets, you pass that same grinning huckster once more. He gives you a wink and offers a sample of his new potion. Cures toothaches and makes dreams sweeter. You politely decline, forcing a smile. You may not have a catchy slogan or dancing frogs, but you've got your leeches, your dusty tomes, and your stubborn sense of right and wrong. And somewhere, deep down, you hope that one day, medicine will be about more than performance. One day, patients will trust the quiet, steady work of truth over the dazzling lie. Until then, you might consider getting a cape, just in case. You squat near the hearth of a peasant's cottage, carefully stirring a bubbling concoction in a dented copper pot. The smell hits you like a brick wall, equal parts onion, vinegar, and something else you're trying not to identify. A thick sludge clings to your wooden spoon. You followed the recipe exactly, even though it calls for crocodile dung, stale beer, and the juice of crushed beetles. If your patient doesn't recover, at least you've successfully created the worst soup in human history. Welcome to medieval pharmacology, where the line between medicine and kitchen mishap is dangerously thin. Unlike your competitors selling cheerful potions from carts, you pride yourself on following traditional remedies passed down through generations of healers. The problem? Most of those recipes were written when science involved equal parts magic, religious interpretation, and pure guesswork. You smear a bit of the mixture onto a cloth and prepare to apply it to a festering wound on your patient's thigh. She flinches, clearly questioning your methods, and possibly your sanity. You gently reassure her. It smells worse than it feels, you mutter, which isn't exactly comforting, but it's all you've got. Historians still argue whether medieval doctors sincerely believed in the healing power of dung, or if it was a desperate, nothing else worked, so maybe this will mentality. Either way, excrement yes, human, animal, and occasionally mythical features prominently in many treatments. Donkey droppings for gout, goose feces for sore throats, crocodile dung for, well, everything apparently. You're not sure if the crocodiles knew they were participating in public health, but their contributions are well documented in dusty scrolls. To be fair, not all medieval remedies are nightmare-inducing. Some herbal treatments have stood the test of time willow bark for pain relief. Hello, future aspirin, garlic for infections, and mint for digestion. But those modest success stories are buried under layers of oddities. You once followed a recipe that called for powdered mummy. Yes, mummy. Imported at great cost from Egypt, ground up and sprinkled onto wounds. The logic? Ancient kings were obviously powerful, so consuming their remains might transfer that power. You don't question it too hard. There's a certain poetry to how bizarre these cures can get. One remedy for baldness involves boiling a mixture of green lizards and molasses, then massaging it into the scalp while reciting Psalm 23 backwards. The result? A sticky head and eternal confusion. You tried it once on yourself during a slow week. Let's just say you're still bald. Sometimes your prescriptions sound more like dares. You tell a woman to rub roasted mouse fat on her aching joints. You instruct a young man to sleep with a frog tied around his neck. You suggest chewing burned toad skin to ease toothaches. To your surprise, patients actually do these things. Whether they believe in your treatments or are just too polite to argue remains unclear. Still, they return, so something must be working, or at least not killing them. But the real kicker? Some of your colleagues are even worse. You've heard rumors of doctors using ground unicorn horn. Spoiler alert, it's just powdered narwhal tusk and dragon's blood, a bright red resin from a palm tree, as miraculous cures. One guy swears by baked owl hearts wrapped in linen for insomnia. Another insists that swallowing gemstones balances the humors. You once attended a lecture, well, more of a drunken tavern argument, where a fellow physician claimed roasted hedgehog lungs were the key to eternal youth. You'd laugh if you weren't fairly certain he was serious. Every now and then, though, a treatment unexpectedly succeeds. A poultice of honey and thyme helps draw infection from a wound. A mix of chamomile and valerian root eases a noblewoman's nightly terrors. These rare wins keep you going, even as the failures pile up and the stench of dubious potions follows you like a curse. You've learned to balance trial and error with ritual and belief. Sometimes healing has less to do with the ingredients and more to do with the patient's faith in them. If a mother believes your dung-based salve can save her child, then the comfort it brings is a kind of medicine in itself. You've started to think of your work as equal parts healer and hope dealer. Of course, there's danger in this hope. You've seen patients delay real help, or at least the medieval version of it, in favor of charms, chance, or drinking wine infused with powdered lead. You once had to explain gently to a knight that the cure his squire gave him, raw sheep liver worn in his boots, wasn't going to stop his infection. He didn't believe you. He also didn't survive. Sometimes, late at night, you pore over old texts by candlelight, hoping to find that one forgotten cure, the one that actually works. You imagine some future scholar discovering your notes, marveling at your insight, and skipping over the dung recipes entirely. For now, you do what you can. You mix, you stir, you smear. You try not to gag. Your patients may never understand the full horror of your ingredients, and frankly, you're fine keeping it that way. If they ask what's in the ointment, you smile mysteriously and say, "Ancient wisdom." They nod, impressed. Nobody needs to know it's mostly lizard and onion. As you clean your tools and toss the last of the unused concoction into the fire, where it hisses and bubbles disturbingly, you sigh. Another day, another foul remedy, another attempt to wrest health from chaos. You're not just practicing medicine. You're experimenting in real time, hoping you don't accidentally invent a new kind of curse. But tomorrow? Tomorrow, you try something with snail slime. Maybe this time it'll work. Maybe. You stand over the patient, knife in hand, sweat collecting on your brow. Not because the room is hot, though it is, but because you're about to perform surgery without anesthesia, without antiseptics, and with only the vaguest idea of what you're doing. Congratulations. You're a medieval surgeon, your patient, wide awake and utterly terrified. And you? Not far behind. He's a soldier with a badly infected leg wound, swollen and purple, oozing something that smells like regret. His comrades carried him here after a skirmish, hopeful that you can cut out the bad part. You nod solemnly, as if this is something you do all the time. You don't, but saying, "I don't know how," in this era is basically a death sentence for both your pride and your patient. Surgery in the Middle Ages is not the noble, precise art of modern operating rooms. It's closer to carpentry, but with more screaming. There's no sterile field, no rubber gloves, no soft music playing in the background, just a table, some rags, and a handful of iron tools that wouldn't look out of place in a blacksmith's kit. You try to focus, though your own stomach is threatening rebellion. You offer the man a leather strap to bite down on. He hesitates, then clamps it between his teeth as your assistant grips his shoulders. There's no countdown, no gentle. Here we go. Just a single swift cut. Historians still argue whether medieval surgery advanced medicine or simply traumatized everyone involved. It did occasionally save lives. Amputations prevented deadly infections from spreading, and lancing boils brought immense, if temporary, relief. But the survival rate was dismal. Infection almost always followed. Shock could kill in hours. Blood loss was the silent executioner. Yet, when nothing else worked, desperate patients chose a blade over a grave. You begin cutting through layers of tissue, and your patient lets out a guttural cry that rattles your soul. You keep going. There's no stopping once you begin. Your blade is duller than you'd like, and halfway through the procedure, you realize you've nicked a blood vessel you probably shouldn't have. Blood sprays across your apron. Your assistant goes pale. You whisper a prayer. You pour wine over the wound, not for ceremony, but because it's the closest thing to an antiseptic you have. Then you pack it with moss and wrap it tightly with cloth, hoping the bleeding stops and the infection stays away. You've seen patients survive worse. You've also seen them die from much less. Either way, you'll know in a day or two. You sit back, lightheaded, your hands trembling. You'd feel proud if you weren't also deeply nauseous. Surgery is never clean. It's rarely successful. And it always haunts you. Surgical training in your time is patchy, at best. Universities teach theory, not hands-on practice. That falls to the barber surgeon's men who cut hair, pull teeth, and amputate limbs, often in the same afternoon. You try not to think about how many lives depend on a man who sharpens blades with the same stone he uses for razors and bone saws. Your own training came from observing a man named Walter, who claimed to have once stitched up a duke. Whether this is true or not remains unclear, especially since Walter also believes in curing headaches by tapping the skull gently with a mallet. Still, you learned the basics: where to cut, when to stop, and how to avoid fainting mid-procedure. Most importantly, you learned how to keep a straight face when someone asks, "Will this hurt?" Of course it will. Everything hurts in medieval surgery. You've removed arrowheads from groins, cauterized wounds with glowing iron rods, and once attempted trepanation, yes, drilling into someone's skull to relieve demonic pressure. That one did not go well. Still, desperate people will try anything, and you're often the only option they have. Your reputation, for better or worse, depends not on how skilled you are, but how confident you appear. Patients want certainty. They don't want to hear maybe or I'll try. They want firm declarations, even if those declarations are based on equal parts guesswork and hope. So you nod gravely, clean your tools, and pretend you weren't shaking moments ago. Occasionally, someone does survive. When they do, it's a miracle. They walk again. They breathe easier. They thank you with bread, coins, or just quiet, tearful relief. These moments fuel you, even as the failures pile higher than your supply of clean bandages. Sometimes you lie awake at night, wondering if you're helping or just prolonging the inevitable. Other times you sleep like a stone exhaustion, outweighing self-doubt. You once watched a patient die mid-procedure. The bleeding wouldn't stop. His wife screamed. His son stood silently in the doorway, eyes wide. You had done everything you knew how to do, and still, it wasn't enough. Later, you found the boy carving your name into a plank of wood. You're not sure if it was a tribute or a warning. And yet, you persist, because someone must. Someone must step into the blood-soaked role of medieval surgeon, with its impossible expectations and gruesome realities. You carry the burden because no one else will. You step outside, peeling off your soiled apron, hands red and raw. You catch a glimpse of yourself in a puddle-tired, grim, hollow-eyed, but alive. And sometimes that's all that matters. Tomorrow, you'll pick up the blade again, maybe to save a life, maybe to hold back death for a little while. You don't get to choose who lives or dies. You just do your best with what little you have. And for now, that has to be enough. Smoke curls through the air as flames lick the edges of ancient parchment. You stand helplessly beside the town square's bonfire, watching a pile of books and scrolls some hundreds of years old crackle into ash. Among them may be a few lines from Galen, perhaps a rare translated page from Avicenna, or even a hand-copied herbal guide your mentor once guarded with his life. All of it gone, because someone accused the scribe of heresy, and everything he touched had to go with him. This isn't your first book burning. Sadly, it won't be the last. In the Middle Ages, knowledge is a fragile, flammable thing. It doesn't spread freely. It doesn't live in cloud storage. It's chained to desks in monasteries, hoarded by nobles, and too often destroyed by fear. The idea that words can be dangerous isn't metaphorical. It's policy. One wrong symbol, one sentence misinterpreted as magic, and the manuscript ends up fueling a fire meant to purify the soul. Yours aches instead. You walk home empty-handed, remembering what was in those texts. Cures written in Arabic, anatomy sketches from a long-dead monk, herbal combinations that once saved a village from dysentery. Historians still argue whether the loss of ancient knowledge was due more to deliberate suppression or to simple neglect. But standing there, watching embers swirl into the dusk, you know one thing for certain. Ignorance spreads faster than wisdom. You once saw a medical diagram, a beautifully detailed image of the human digestive system, copied by candlelight in the margins of a theological tract. The scribe who showed it to you kept it hidden between pages about angels, hoping no one would notice. He whispered that it came from the Greeks, passed down through generations and smuggled across continents. You studied it with awe. A week later, his workshop was raided. The diagram vanished. Your own collection of texts is modest. 2 full books, several fragmented scrolls, and a handful of notes scribbled during lectures you weren't technically allowed to attend. One of them discusses urine color, a surprisingly diagnostic subject in medieval medicine. Another outlines a rudimentary surgical method for repairing broken ribs. You guard them like treasure, wrapping them in oilskin and hiding them beneath a loose floorboard, just in case. Because here, learning can be criminal, particularly if it comes from foreign lands. Many of the best medical texts in the medieval world come from Islamic scholars Avicenna, al-Razi, and others whose names never appear in your official curriculum. The irony is suffocating. You learn more from these forbidden texts than from a dozen Latin lectures on humors and astrology, but sharing them openly risks your life. So you read by moonlight, memorize diagrams, and pray your curiosity doesn't cost you everything. Sometimes you dream about a world where knowledge is copied, not condemned, where doctors have access to libraries, not hearsay, where students argue over ideas instead of hiding them. But in your world, libraries burn and scholars are silenced. The only safe medicine is the one that fits within the Church's doctrine, and even that's a moving target. You once witnessed a heated debate between 2 physicians. One argued that fever comes from too much blood. The other claimed it was caused by sin and impure thoughts. Neither mentioned bacteria. Of course, that discovery is centuries away, but the second doctor won the crowd. Why? Because he quoted a saint, not a scientist. That's what passes for evidence here. Even within monasteries, where many of the surviving texts are copied and stored, knowledge is filtered. Monks prioritize scripture over science. They might transcribe Hippocrates, but only if his words can be interpreted as theological allegory. Anatomy becomes metaphor. Disease becomes punishment. Healing becomes prayer. Still, there are glimmers of resistance. A nun you once knew, Sister Cecilia, secretly kept a notebook of remedies she tested herself. She shared a salve for boils made from rose oil and beeswax, and a fever tea that worked better than anything in your leech kit. She called it divine inspiration, but you suspected it was just careful observation. When her notebook was discovered, the abbot had it burned. She was reassigned to silence and kitchen duty. You never saw her again. And yet, despite the fear, despite the flames, knowledge refuses to die. It survives in whispers, in coded diagrams, in recipes passed from mother to daughter, in symbols scratched onto cellar walls. You sometimes wonder how many cures had been lost, how many lives could have been saved if someone hadn't decided a diagram looked too pagan. There's even a theory spoken only behind closed doors that the plague spread so wildly, not just because of its virulence, but because Europe burned the very knowledge that might have helped contain it. Maybe someone somewhere had an idea about isolation, about washing hands, about the dangers of rodents. But their voice was drowned out by fire and fear. You return to your room and light a single candle. Then, from beneath your floorboard, you retrieve your most treasured book, a battered, annotated copy of Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, translated by a merchant who barely escaped Spain with his life. The Latin is messy, the diagrams water-damaged, but the knowledge? Invaluable. You run your fingers along the spine, whisper a quick thanks to whatever cosmic force protected it, and begin copying a section into your own notes, just in case. You never know when fire will come again, because in the Middle Ages, doctors don't just fight disease. They fight ignorance, dogma, and the terrifying possibility that the cure was lost in smoke centuries ago. A woman kneels in the middle of the marketplace, her hands red with blood not from injury, but from helping deliver a baby in the cramped backroom of a cobbler's shop. You recognize her immediately. Marta, the village midwife, sharp-eyed and unshakable. You've seen her save lives with nothing more than boiled linens and whispered instructions. You've also seen the way people look at her when she walks by, not with admiration, but with suspicion. Marta is what modern minds might call a natural healer. In your time, she's simply a woman who knows too much. Midwives, herbalists, and wise women form the invisible backbone of medieval medicine, especially in rural villages where trained physicians like you rarely visit. They know what roots reduce fever, which teas calm labor pains, and how to deliver a breech baby with steady hands and nerves of steel. But their power doesn't sit well with authority, especially when they save lives better than the men in robes and beaked masks. Historians still argue whether the persecution of these women stemmed more from misogyny or fear of unregulated medicine. Truthfully, it's both. Marta, for instance, has delivered more babies than the town priest has given sermons. Yet the church eyes her with discomfort. How dare she heal without invoking saints? How dare she know what a uterus looks like? You once assisted her during a complicated birth well. Assisted might be generous. You mostly stood in the corner, wide-eyed, trying not to faint as she barked orders like a battlefield commander. The child was born blue and silent, but Marta thumped its back with a rhythm that seemed more instinct than science. A wail filled the room. The mother wept. You nearly joined her. Later, you asked Marta where she learned so much. From my mother, she said with a shrug, and from paying attention. That response terrified the local clergy more than if she'd claimed to study with demons. The accusations start small murmurs of unnatural remedies. A curious rash healed too quickly. A woman surviving childbirth, who, by all logic, shouldn't have. You know where this is going. You've seen it before. 1 minute, she's a healer. The next, she's a witch. They come for her at dusk. You hear the shouting from the square and rush outside. Villagers surround Marta's cottage, torches in hand, led not by a priest, but by a jealous competitor, man who sells ineffective tonics and resents that she's more trusted than he is. They demand to see the demon herbs. They claim she caused a cow to miscarry with a glance, that she cured a toothache with a charm. You step in, shouting reason. You point out that she's saved half the village, that her remedies work. That calling her a witch is not only absurd, it's dangerous. Some pause, others glare. Marta meets your eyes. There's no fear in hers, just exhaustion. You manage to delay them, but not stop them. She's dragged to the village's edge and locked in a barn while someone rides off to fetch higher authority. She's to be questioned, possibly tried. And if that happens, you know how it ends. You pace all night. This isn't just injustice, it's sabotage. The system that barely functions already is about to destroy one of its most competent members. And for what? Pride? Power? Control? You've spent years listening to incompetent men mumble about humors while Marta saved lives with boiled nettle and firm hands. The next morning, you return with documents, treatises from monasteries that mention her techniques. You speak of Hippocrates and Galen loudly, so the more educated villagers nod along. You even quote a bishop you met once, who vaguely praised the wisdom of healing women. You don't know if he meant Marta specifically, but at this point, close enough. It works. Or maybe the villagers grow bored. Either way, Marta is released. She doesn't thank you. She just returns to her work. That night, she delivers twins. Both survive. The mother does too. Word spreads. Gratitude trickles back into the village's collective memory. But the fear never fully fades. One wrong step, one illness too well cured, and she could be accused again. You know she sleeps with one eye open. You would too. This isn't just Marta's story. Across Europe, women healers face suspicion as often as they face childbirth. Some are burned. Some banished. Some simply vanish. The irony? Many of them know more about the human body than university-trained doctors. They study herbs, track symptoms, adapt treatments over generations. They're scientists in all but name, and in this time, that makes them dangerous. You once asked a scholar why women aren't allowed into formal medical schools. He laughed. Too emotional, he said. Too distractible. You wanted to ask how that explained the student who fainted during a dissection, or the professor who misdiagnosed himself with an excess of black bile when he was just hungover. You didn't. You've learned to pick your battles. And so, these women continue in the shadows, quietly healing, carefully surviving. They pass knowledge down in whispers, through recipes and rituals, through muscle memory and lullabies. You begin writing down what you learned from Marta, not just for your patients, but to preserve it. Because one day, someone might burn your notes. And if that happens, let them at least be copied somewhere else. The world will change eventually. Centuries from now, women will fill lecture halls, lead research teams, design hospitals. But right now, in this moment, healing wears a linen apron, not a robe, and its hands are stained with herbs, not ink. You glance across the square and see Marta slipping into a home, summoned for another birth. She moves like a ghost, silent, focused, invisible when she needs to be. And in your heart, you know, no matter how many books you read or surgeries you perform, you'll never match her when it comes to bringing someone into this world, or keeping them in it. You wave a smoldering bundle of herbs near the window, hoping the acrid smoke does more than just irritate your eyes. Behind you, Your patient coughs violently into a rag, the cloth already streaked with crimson. You inhale through your nose, immediately regretting it. The air in this room is thick with fear, rot, and something no one dares name. But don't worry. According to medieval medicine, it's not bacteria or viruses making your patient ill. It's the air itself, or more specifically, bad air. Miasma, they call it. The theory is simple, elegant in its wrongness. Miasma, the invisible vapor of filth, decay, and sin, is believed to be the root of disease. It floats on the wind, creeps through open windows, and clings to damp walls like an invisible assassin. It explains why poor neighborhoods fall sick faster, why graveyards stink, and why summer always seems to bring plagues. And it gives people something to fight, even if the enemy is imaginary. You walk through the home trailing herbs like a medieval air freshener. Rosemary, thyme, lavender. Sometimes you burn tar or sulfur, anything pungent. The idea is to mask or better, chase away the foul smells that medieval medicine believes are killing people. Historians still argue whether miasma theory was simply a placeholder for unknown causes, or a desperate cultural attempt to make sense of unpredictable sickness. You think it was both. After all, without microscopes or germ theory, bad smells are the next best culprit. But let's not be too hard on miasma theory. It sort of helped. The belief that smell equals danger encouraged people to air out rooms, avoid standing water, and steer clear of open sewage. Granted, they did these things while wearing beaked masks stuffed with flowers, but still baby steps. Of course, some interpretations of miasma theory get wildly theatrical. In certain cities, massive bells are rung to shake the air clean. Others fire cannons into fog, hoping the blast will disperse disease. You once visited a town that hung bundles of onions from every doorway. When you asked why, the answer was simple: they soak up the poison. The onions didn't help. The plague still came. But it gave people something to do, some illusion of control, in a world where control is rare. In fact, your own mentor was obsessed with scented waters. He created an entire shelf of aromatic mixtures: rose, mint, myrrh, and for some reason, boiled horseradish. If it makes your eyes water, he used to say, it must be working. You pretended to agree, even when the horseradish nearly made you sneeze yourself into unconsciousness. And then there are the clothes. Rich families commission perfumes by the bucketful. They bathe in rose water and insist on dousing their pets, their rugs, even their tapestries. One nobleman you treated asked you to diagnose his illness by smelling his chamber curtains. You did. They smelled like cinnamon and fear. But perhaps the strangest part of miasma theory isn't the logic, it's how persistent it is. Even when people start to notice that caretakers and gravediggers fall ill more than others, they don't connect it to touch or proximity. They blame the air around the dead, not the dead themselves. You once saw a man blame his cat's diarrhea on a neighbor's miasma drifting through a cracked wall. The cat, you should note, had eaten nothing but spoiled eel for 3 days. Yet miasma theory isn't all bad. It encouraged cleanliness, sort of. You're told to avoid foul odors, which leads you to recommend bathing, occasionally, when there's time, and soap, and enough heat to make the process bearable. Still, one mustn't bathe too often, of course. Everyone knows wet skin lets disease in. Because logic. You keep a vinegar-soaked rag tied to your belt at all times, which you raise to your face whenever the smell of a patient's wound becomes unbearable. Whether it's masking miasma or just helping you not faint, it does the job. You've even seen doctors wave these rags like talismans before entering homes. One physician made a ritual of it, performing what looked suspiciously like a dance. You didn't ask questions. Eventually, you start creating your own scent blends. Some help clear your sinuses. Others just help you forget the stink of gangrene for 5 blessed minutes. You're particularly fond of a lavender and clove combo that makes patients slightly less panicked when you walk into the room. The olfactory version of bedside manner. But the real tragedy of miasma theory isn't the smells, it's the misdirection. For centuries, energy, resources, and lives are spent fighting phantoms, while true causes of disease-contaminated water, poor hygiene, person-to-person transmission go ignored. You've seen towns burn entire fields of flowers because they believed the blooms harbored the bad air. You've watched mothers tie bundles of herbs to their children's collars, believing it would protect them from plague. And when those children still fell ill, they blamed the wind. One day, you visit a monastery and stumble upon a monk experimenting with boiling water to clean his instruments. He calls it cleansing by purity. You call it unintentional science. His patients survive more often than yours, which is deeply unfair. But you take note. Maybe it's not the air at all. Maybe it's something on the things we touch. You dare not say it aloud. After all, to question miasma theory is to question everyone, your teachers, your colleagues, your own past treatments. That's not just risky, it's heretical. So you stay silent, keep burning rosemary, and nod wisely whenever someone asks if the stench is the problem. You respond, "It's always the air," and then try to remember not to breathe too deeply. And so, you continue. You wave your herbs. You soak your scarves. You whisper encouragements as your patient coughs beside the window, and you hope fervently, helplessly, that the air isn't all that's killing him. Because deep down, you suspect the truth. It's not the smell. It's something smaller, something invisible. But that answer won't come for centuries. Until then, you light another bundle of time and lean into the lie. You sit beside a sickbed, eyeing your patient like a puzzle, missing half its pieces. Their skin is flushed, breath shallow, and pulse erratic, though no one really knows how to count a pulse properly in this era. So you mostly judge by how panicked they look. And as usual, it all comes down to those slippery, invisible fluids inside them. No, not blood, though that one gets all the attention. You're thinking of the 4 humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. The medieval doctor's all-purpose excuse, explanation, and occasionally punchline. Every illness, every discomfort, every embarrassing rash you name, it gets blamed on the imbalance of these 4 mysterious substances sloshing around the human body. You don't have the means to see them, of course, but you know they're in there. All the best books say so. Galen said so. And in the Middle Ages, Galen is basically your co-pilot. Today, you suspect your patient suffers from an excess of black bile. Why? Because they're quiet, melancholic, and have been wearing the same gray robe for a week. That's as diagnostic as it gets. You prescribe a bitter tonic to purge the bile and suggest long walks in sunlight and cheerful conversation. So, essentially, you're a therapist, pharmacist, and motivational speaker, all in one. Historians still argue whether the humoral theory was a genuine attempt to understand biology or just intellectual filler to make medieval doctors sound more authoritative. Probably both. You've mastered the art of sounding certain while saying nothing. Ah, yes, you murmur gravely. A clear case of phlegmatic imbalance. No one knows what that means, including you, but it always earns a respectful nod. You reach for your well-worn copy of the humor chart, beautifully illustrated with diagrams of red-cheeked, sweaty figures for sanguine, sallow and sour expressions for choleric, cold and slow for phlegmatic, and gaunt, gloomy eyes for melancholic. It's more a mood board than a medical guide, but in your world, it's gospel. Diagnosis complete, treatment begins, and that's where the chaos really starts. If the patient is too hot, you prescribe cooling herbs and lots of sleep. Too cold? Spicy foods and vigorous exercise. Too moist? Diuretics. Too dry? Bloodletting, obviously. Some days you feel more like a weatherman than a physician, constantly adjusting your patient's internal climate. One noblewoman insisted she had damp lungs and needed warm goat's milk infused with cinnamon. You provided it. She got better? Coincidence? Maybe. But you told everyone it was your humoral mastery. One of the strangest things about humors is how they affect not just medicine, but personality. That moody butcher in town? Melancholic. The gossipy maid? Sanguine. The perpetually angry cook? Classic choleric. Everyone becomes a walking mood-based weather pattern. You once broke up a bar fight by explaining that both men were suffering from excess yellow bile. They blinked, confused, then nodded like you'd unlocked the secrets of the universe. You hadn't, but they stopped punching. Treating humor imbalances isn't just physical, it's dietary too. Each food is assigned humoral properties. Cabbage is cold and dry. Pork is moist and hot. Wine? Hot and dry, but only red wine. White wine is somehow cooler. You once spent an hour convincing a wealthy merchant to switch from pears to apples to balance his cold, phlegmatic tendencies. He thanked you with a gift basket full of pears. Of course, sometimes your patients don't have an imbalance. Sometimes they're dying from infections, parasites, or things you don't even have names for. But you can't say that. So you pick a humor, blame it, treat it, and hope they recover. If they don't, you pick a different humor and try again. It's a strange, rotating dance of invisible fluids, invisible symptoms. Like playing darts in the dark, with the patient's life as the target. You once encountered a man who'd been treated for excess blood every week for a year. His physician insisted on regular bleedings to restore balance. By the time you arrived, he was ghost pale and fainted every time someone sneezed too loud. You prescribed rest, broth, and no bleeding. He recovered within a week. His physician accused you of suppressing his bile. You didn't argue. You just smiled and left. There's a fringe of your profession that's starting to question all this. Quietly, of course. Whispered ideas that maybe the humors aren't the whole story. That maybe disease doesn't come from moist melancholy, but the institutions aren't ready. The universities teach Galen. The guilds test you on humor theory. Even the nobility expect you to talk about bile and balance. So you do, with flair. And sometimes, just sometimes, it works. You've seen patients perk up after treatments that, by modern standards, should have done nothing. Maybe it's the placebo effect. Maybe the foods actually helped. Or maybe belief itself is a kind of healing. When someone truly thinks they're being made whole, they often act like it. And that act? It changes everything. You step outside for air, reviewing your cases in your head. A phlegmatic merchant, a melancholic scribe, a choleric bishop with gout and rage in equal measure. You're juggling invisible liquids with every visit, each diagnosis another guess, dressed up in the robes of tradition. Will you still be treating humors in 10 years? Probably. Will it still be 90% guesswork? Definitely. But as long as the patients nod, the nobles pay, and the guilds approve, you'll keep stirring your metaphorical pot. After all, you're not just balancing fluids. You're balancing fear, tradition, and the terrifying unknown. And in that fragile equilibrium, the theory of humors still somehow holds. The chamber is thick with the scent of incense. Velvet drapes hang over stained glass windows, and the man lying on the bed has more rings on his fingers than you have tools in your medical kit. You clear your throat softly, but he doesn't acknowledge you. He's not ignoring you out of rudeness. No, this is something much more medieval. He's noble, and therefore, in his mind, naturally wiser, healthier, and biologically superior to the likes of you. Treating nobility is one of the most difficult, delicate, and occasionally ridiculous parts of your job. Not because their diseases are stranger, though some certainly are, but because your patients believe they are, by divine right, immune to the rules of medicine. They demand cures that flatter their status, not necessarily those grounded in any sort of logic. Today's patient, Lord Henry of Greystone Keep, has a mysterious ailment. By mysterious, you mean gout. But calling it would insult his station. Gout is for peasants who eat too much salted meat and don't bathe. Lord Henry insists his pain is the result of a spiritual imbalance caused by celestial disfavor. He also refuses to stop eating roasted swan, stuffed with truffles and candied figs. You gently suggest a simpler diet. He chuckles, and instructs his steward to bring you a gift basket of cheeses, to thank you for your silly little advice. Historians still argue whether the refusal of medieval elites to follow medical advice was due to arrogance, ignorance, or sheer denial. You suspect it's a potent cocktail of all three, garnished with inherited titles and a splash of selective memory. You once treated a duchess who had, for some reason, decided that rose petals should be applied to her forehead hourly. To balance my inner son, she explained. You didn't have the heart to tell her that wasn't a thing. So you provided the petals, and she paid you in gold. Win-win? The challenge isn't just compliance, it's ego. You must perform medicine as theater, every gesture carefully measured to reinforce their illusion of control. You don't suggest remedies. You present options that they are free to accept, reject, or modify on a whim. When you recommend a bleeding, they demand it be done only with gold-tipped lancets. When you suggest an herbal salve, they request it be infused with saffron, because of course they do. One nobleman once demanded you consult his astrologer before applying a poultice to his foot. The astrologer, a man named Brother Hugo, who may or may not have been drunk, declared Mercury was in opposition, and therefore no foot touching today. You waited 3 hours, reapplied the poultice after sundown, and were promptly accused of causing Mercury to sulk. Mercury, it turns out, is very moody. Some nobles do respect you, sort of. They trust your expertise in the same way they trust their falconer or wine steward. Useful, entertaining, but ultimately replaceable. You are a tool in their chest of luxuries, and if your advice becomes inconvenient, there's always someone else with a fancier coat and a more exotic accent, willing to say what they want to hear. One time, you advised a baron to stop taking powdered pearl, which he insisted strengthened his essence. It was wrecking his digestion. He scoffed, called in an alchemist from Florence, and the man prescribed powdered emerald instead. The baron thanked you both. You never figured out who was more wrong. But despite the eye rolls and silent frustration, there are moments, rare, shining moments, where you manage to help. The noblewoman who actually followed your instructions and survived childbirth. The count who gave up his daily indulgence in spiced lamb after your warnings, and whose gout slowly receded. These victories are small, but meaningful, like finding a flower growing through castlestone. Still, every interaction requires balance. Say too little, and they lose interest. Say too much, and they feel challenged. Once, you corrected a duke who misquoted Galen, and he ordered you to spend the night in the stables to cool your humors. You developed an impressive rash, and never quoted Galen again. What's more, nobles fear disease not just for the suffering, but for what it reveals: mortality. And nothing terrifies someone raised to believe they are superior more than realizing they're still just human. So they cloak their ailments in ceremony, distractions, and denial. It's not the plague, one insisted, despite his entire household dropping like flies. It's seasonal vapor. Sure, your grace, very seasonal. And you, the physician, walk a tightrope. You must soothe without surrendering, guide without commanding, and somehow make your patient feel both in charge and utterly dependent on your wisdom. It's exhausting. It's infuriating. And honestly, it's kind of impressive how often you pull it off. You've learned tricks. You flatter their intellect while slipping in the truth. You hide bitter herbs in sweet syrups. You present lifestyle changes as fashionable trends. Everyone in Rome is eating less pork, you say. It's very in vogue. They lap it up, and 3 weeks later, their digestion improves. No one thanks you for the idea, but they do take credit for their natural constitution. You walk out of Lord Henry's chambers that afternoon, having prescribed a very subtle change in diet and a foot bath infused with thyme and sea salt. He'll think it was his idea. You'll pretend it was too. Everyone wins. As you leave the estate, you pass the servants' quarters, where a stable boy lies with a fever, curled on a straw mat. No astrologers, no velvet, no protest. Just a boy, quietly sick. You kneel, feel his forehead, and apply the same treatment you gave to Henry. The difference? He thanks you. And as the sun sets behind the castle walls, you remember why you keep doing this. Not for the titles, not for the coin, but for the people who don't argue when you try to save their lives. You step into the lecture hall, or what passes for one in this chilly stone monastery. A vaulted room with uneven benches, unlit torches, and the distinct scent of ink, wax, and unwashed feet. You squeeze into a seat beside a boy who looks about 12 and is holding his quill like it's a dagger. This is medieval medical school, the birthplace of future physicians, the graveyard of reasonable expectations. Your professor arrives, robes dragging, beard reaching heroic proportions, and begins the day's lesson by reciting a passage from Galen. He does this every morning. You're beginning to suspect he's memorized only that passage and is hoping no one notices. The lesson today? The liver is the source of all appetites. You nod thoughtfully, though you're pretty sure your appetite has more to do with the fact that breakfast was a single piece of bread and a judgmental stare from the kitchen nun. Medical education in the Middle Ages is complicated. Historians still argue whether it was a true scientific endeavor or just a theatrical tradition of memorizing old texts. What's certain is that most schools rely on repetition over experimentation, tradition over testing. You are taught what Aristotle thought, what Galen guessed, and what Avicenna carefully catalogued, but rarely are you encouraged to question any of it. Asking why is often met with a frown and the subtle clearing of a throat that means, don't push it. There are no cadavers in today's lesson. In fact, most students here will never see one. Dissection is rare and controversial, often forbidden outright by local laws or religious decree. You once heard that in Bologna, they allow it under special circumstances. But here, the closest you'll get is a diagram drawn by someone who probably guessed what lungs look like based on sheep. Your fellow students are a mixed bunch. Some are genuinely curious. Others are here for the prestige. A few have wealthy parents who want them to carry on the family tradition of confusing medical treatment with social climbing. One boy spends the entire lesson sketching elaborate doodles of winged testicles. You decide not to ask. You copy everything diligently, even the bits that make no sense. Blood is hot and wet. Phlegm is cold and wet. Yellow bile is hot and dry. Black bile is cold and dry. It's like a weather report from a realm of imaginary fluids. Still, you commit it to memory, because your exam will require it, and by exam, you mean a single oral recitation in front of a panel of half-asleep monks. Education here isn't cheap, either. If you're lucky, you've been sponsored by a guild, a wealthy patron, or a religious order. If not, you're paying in coin, favors, or the occasional service that's best not spoken of. The cost of books alone could bankrupt a merchant. Most are hand-copied manuscripts, chained to library desks, jealously guarded by scholars who believe knowledge should be shared slowly, cautiously, and preferably not with you. Your favorite subject is materia medica herbal medicine. At least there, things make some sense. Willow bark helps with pain. Mint soothes the stomach. Even if you're taught to categorize them by temperament, mint is cold and dry. You can at least see their effects. You even start your own personal herbal journal discreetly, of course, since personal observation is frowned upon. You call it Notes from the Garden of Curiosity. Someday, you hope someone reads it. But most days aren't about discovery. They're about discipline. Sit straight. Copy faster. Don't question. A fellow student once asked whether pus in a wound might mean infection. The lecturer paused, blinked slowly, and responded, "Pus is a sign of healing. Always has been." The student nodded. You both knew better, but you also knew to stay quiet. Then there's the ritual of rhetoric presenting your knowledge, not just accurately, but beautifully. Medical school is as much about performance as it is about practice. You are taught to use Latin fluently, to quote the right scholars, to phrase your suggestions humbly, as Galen suggests, or according to the learned Avicenna. If you dare suggest something original, brace for silence at best, scorn at worst. There's no practical training with patients. No internships, no clinical rounds. Your first encounter with a real sick person will likely be after graduation, alone, with nothing but your notes and a strong stomach. You often wonder how many brilliant minds left this place only to faint at the sight of a boil. Still, you endure, because every now and then, a real gem falls into your lap. A monk shares a forgotten text. A traveling scholar from Cordoba whispers about translated Arabic manuscripts filled with surgical techniques that actually work. One teacher, a soft-spoken friar with ink-stained fingers, slips you a page from an old Greek anatomy manual and says, "Don't tell the abbot." You live for those moments. They remind you that medicine is more than repetition. It's a living, breathing thing if only the system would let it breathe. Eventually, graduation arrives. Or rather, permission to practice. You pass your oral exam by flawlessly regurgitating everything your professors taught, pausing only once to wipe nervous sweat off your brow. You're handed a piece of parchment with a wax seal and a promise that you're now qualified. You immediately feel unqualified. Still, you've made it. You're officially a physician, ready to enter the world and do what exactly? That part no one prepares you for. But you carry your books, your notes, your memory of every half-baked theory, and hope that somewhere out there, knowledge will evolve and take you with it. You awaken to the sound of church bells not for mass, but for morning. Again, the plague has returned, sweeping through the town like a wind carrying silence and screams in equal measure. You pull your cloak tight, grab your satchel of herbs and ointments, and step into the dim morning light, already knowing today will not be about healing. Today will be about witnessing. The street is quieter than it should be. Curtains flutter from closed windows. A lone cart trundles past, loaded with shrouded bodies, the driver holding a perfumed cloth to his face. You nod as he passes. There's no use speaking. Words feel too thin, too powerless here. The Black Death, the great pestilence. Call it what you like, it doesn't care. It has no favorites, no mercy, and no pattern you can trust. You've treated barons and bakers, monks and midwives. Some live, most do not. And despite your prayers, your poultices, your mixtures of rose oil, vinegar, and crushed sapphire, nothing works. Not really. You enter your patient's home, a cramped room where a mother lies motionless on the bed, her skin darkened with blotches that mark the end. Her son sits beside her, too weak to cry. You kneel, take her hand cold, but not yet stiff, and whisper a blessing. There is nothing else to do. Historians still argue whether medieval doctors helped or harmed during the plague. Some say you offered comfort and tried what little was known. Others point out that your very presence may have spread it further. You try not to dwell on it. You burn your clothes nightly. You bathe in vinegar. You avoid touching anything unnecessarily. But deep down, you suspect it isn't enough. The theories of the day are as jumbled as your own thoughts. Miasma is blamed, again. The stars, two Mercury's alignment, is particularly suspicious. Some say it's a punishment from God, that the sins of mankind have finally overflowed heaven's patience. Others mutter about poisoned wells, Jews, witches, foreigners. Fear makes monsters of everyone. You've stopped trying to explain. These days, you just listen. You once worked with a group of physicians who tried to track the spread. They noted patterns, mapped towns, counted days between infections. It was the closest you'd seen to actual scientific thinking in your profession. Then the monastery housing the records burned down. Some say it was accident. Others, less so. Still, you keep notes in your own journal, hidden beneath your cot. Observations, symptoms, survival rates, treatments tried. You're not sure if anyone will ever read them, but you write them anyway, as if the act itself could hold back the plague. Sometimes you dream of breakthroughs, a medicine that truly works, a cure born not of superstition or ritual, but real understanding. But in the waking world, all you have is what you can carry. Sage, vinegar, rosemary, leeches, and increasingly despair. You reach another home. This one has already been marked with a painted X on the door. Inside, no one answers. You push gently, the door creaking open to reveal a tragedy that has already finished. You whisper a prayer and leave a sprig of lavender on the threshold. The plague doesn't just kill, it robs. Of life, yes, but also of ceremony, dignity, and goodbye. The dead pile up faster than they can be buried. Funerals are rushed. Last rites are mumbled. Whole families vanish between morning and dusk. You've stopped trying to remember every name. It hurts too much. Still, there are small mercies. A child recovers. An elderly man coughs less today. A fever breaks. Each tiny victory feels like a mountain climbed. You celebrate with a silent nod, a tighter grip on your satchel, a quiet thank you to whatever force might be listening. You remember one woman, Adeline, mid-30s, mother of 4. You were sure she'd die. You gave her herbs, wrapped her sores, stayed for hours reading psalms when she asked. And yet, somehow, she survived. Weeks later, she came to your door with a fresh-baked loaf of bread and a quiet smile. No words, just gratitude. It was the first time in months you felt human. But not all stories end that way. Too many end with you standing in a doorway, telling someone their wife, brother, child will not make it through the night. You try to soften the words, but there's no softening death. Only proximity. Only presence. Even the other physicians have begun to abandon their posts. Some flee to the countryside. Others join religious orders, believing penance offers better odds than poultices. A few, yourself included, remain, not because you're brave, not because you think you can win, but because someone has to look into dying eyes and say, you are not alone. And that matters. In a world ravaged by a disease no one understands, with treatments that fail more often than they work, the most powerful thing you can offer is your presence. Your willingness to stay in the room, to hold a hand, to whisper a blessing, to acknowledge the life even as it fades. You finish the day numb, clothes burned, hands scrubbed raw, notes scribbled. You light a candle, sit in silence, and stare into the flame. Tomorrow, the bells will toll again. Tomorrow, the pestilence will rise again. But tomorrow, so will you. You sit at a long wooden table, rubbing your temples while the town baker enthusiastically describes how he cured his cousin's boils, using a goose feather and a silver coin blessed by a monk. Across the room, someone else nods and begins detailing how their neighbor avoided illness for an entire year by hanging a dried mole over the doorway. You nod politely, trying not to scream into your mulled wine. Welcome to the other great force in medieval medicine, superstition. While you've spent years memorizing dusty Latin texts and refining your diagnostic eye, many of your patients still believe illness comes from curses, angry spirits, or stepping on the wrong kind of mushroom during a full moon. And sometimes, just sometimes, you wonder if they're right. Superstition isn't just alive in the Middle Ages. It's thriving. People carry amulets filled with toad bones, recite protective rhymes when passing graveyards, and swear that sneezing 3 times in a row means your blood is turning to vinegar. You once heard a peasant woman claim that rubbing her knees with slug slime kept the Black Death at bay. You didn't have the heart to tell her that the pustules on her calves suggested otherwise. Historians still argue whether medieval superstition should be seen as quaint folklore or dangerous misinformation. From your perspective, it's both. Sometimes it comforts. Sometimes it confuses. And occasionally, it outright sabotages any real chance you have of helping someone. Take, for instance, the man who refused to drink your herbal infusion because a dream told him rosemary would invite demons. Or the young woman who unwrapped your carefully cleaned bandages and replaced them with bread crusts blessed by a wandering friar. You tried to intervene gently, diplomatically. The Lord works in many ways, you say with a tight smile, while mentally listing all the infections this will cause. You learned early on not to challenge these beliefs head-on. Telling someone their grandmother's spell book is nonsense only ensures they'll never let you in the door again. So you've become an expert in compromise. You mix their charms with your treatments. You say your tonics were blessed by the stars. You add prayers to your prescriptions. Healing, in your time, is a theatrical collaboration between medicine and myth. It gets even more complicated when the church weighs in. Official doctrine is wary of superstition, branding many folk practices as pagan or heretical. But ironically, the church also encourages its own brand of magical thinking. Relics of saints, holy water, indulgences for health. You once watched a man crawl to a shrine on his knees for 3 days, convinced that the bones of Saint Ermentrude would heal his failing eyesight. He arrived infected, exhausted, and nearly blind. You gave him a salve and a rest. The saint got the credit. You're not bitter. Not really. Just bemused. One of your favorite superstitions is the belief that illness can be trapped in objects. You've been handed jars sealed with wax, said to contain bad air. People will pay you to bury them in the woods or throw them in the river. You oblige, sometimes whispering a few words in Latin for dramatic effect. If it makes them feel better and doesn't involve slug slime, you consider it a win. Then there are the seasonal beliefs. In spring, everything is seen as renewing, so people go wild with rituals, jumping over fires, washing in dew, wearing green. In winter, sickness is blamed on spirit coldness, which you're still not sure how to treat other than suggesting hot soup. One winter, a family insisted their fireplace was cursed and asked you to bless it with a sage bundle. You did. It smoked terribly. They were thrilled. The nobility aren't immune either. A baron once kept a dead weasel under his bed to repel fever demons. Another believed firmly that illness entered the body through the soles of the feet, so he wore thick wooden clogs at all times, including while bathing. He broke a toe once trying to leap from a window during a fire drill. You tried not to laugh. You failed. Even your fellow physicians aren't entirely above the fray. One colleague swears by a specific prayer muttered 3 times before any surgery. Another insists that certain herbs must be harvested only by left-handed virgins on moonless nights. You don't ask questions. You just nod and pass the wine. And yet, despite its absurdities, superstition sometimes helps. Not because it cures, but because it soothes. People want rituals. They want control. In a world where death rides invisibly on the wind, where doctors guess more often than they heal, a chant or a charm offers structure. And you, medieval physician that you are, have come to respect that. So you learn to weave medicine and myth together. You let the patient place a holy medallion under their pillow, as long as they take your fever tonic. You time your visit after their rituals are done, not during. You let them sprinkle blessed salt in your footprints, though you still don't know what that one's for. Do you believe in all of it? No. But do you dismiss it? Also no. Because dismissing it means losing trust. And trust, you've learned, is more valuable than the finest salve. You head home that night with a full belly, a new story about a haunted duck that causes coughing fits, and somehow a silver coin wrapped in nettle leaves given to you for protection. You tuck it into your bag, not because it works, but just in case. You stand at the altar steps of the village chapel, not as a worshiper, but as a physician, summoned to consult on a case that medicine alone apparently cannot cure. The patient is a young girl who hasn't spoken in days, her body curled like a withered leaf. The priest has already sprinkled her with holy water. The mother clutches a small cloth doll, tied with rosemary. And you? You hold a pouch of dried herbs, feeling utterly redundant. Welcome to the world of saints and miracles, where the divine takes center stage, and you, the trained physician, are often the understudy. In the Middle Ages, medicine and religion are not separate forces. They're uneasy roommates, sharing space in the same village, often eyeing each other with suspicion. The church, ever present, encourages prayer as the first response to illness, sometimes the only response. You've seen entire villages walk barefoot to a distant shrine because someone coughed twice after dinner. You've also seen those same villagers ignore your advice completely once a priest declares, her soul is troubled, not her lungs. Historians still argue whether spiritual healing in this era offered comfort or obstructed progress. You'd say both. On good days, miracles give people hope. On bad days, they delay real treatment. You've arrived at homes where incense chokes the air, crosses are nailed to every surface, and the patient hasn't seen a drop of water or a dose of medicine in 3 days. Because the saints will provide. You kneel beside the girl and check her temperature with the back of your hand. feverish, skin dry, pulse weak. Probably an infection, treatable if you're allowed to treat it. But the priest insists she needs more prayers. And since you value your skin and your job, you don't argue. Instead, you ask to bless the herbs before applying them. It's a compromise. The mother nods, eyes filled with equal parts gratitude and worry. You've developed a repertoire for these situations. You invoke Saint Sebastian for protection from plague, Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Dymphna for mental illness. You sprinkle holy water over your poultices, mutter Latin blessings, and hope no one asks where in Scripture it says that thyme tea reduces fever. It doesn't, but it works. You recall a man in a nearby village who refused all treatment, insisting his boils were punishment for pride. He sought absolution, fasted for 3 days, and died whispering psalms. His family called it a blessed passing. You called it preventable. But in this world, salvation sometimes ranks higher than survival. Miracles, though rare, are powerful currency. One nun once claimed her cough disappeared after touching a relic said to contain a shred of Mary's veil. She told everyone. Suddenly, that convent became a hotspot for the ill and desperate. You visited out of curiosity. The air was sweet with candle wax and desperation. You didn't see any recoveries, but you did witness peace, and sometimes peace is its own kind of healing. The Church's official stance on miracles is cautious. Real miracles must be documented, verified, approved by a bishop, which means many smaller miracles go unacknowledged, whispered about, but never written down. Like the widow who swears her son survived fever because she prayed to a saint whose name she can't remember. Or the boy whose limp vanished after he kissed a holy statue during a rainstorm. Coincidence? Maybe, but you've learned not to say so aloud. Not all miracles are dramatic. Some are small. A prayer whispered before surgery, a relic tied to a child's wrist during illness. You once stitched a wound while a monk read psalms beside you. The patient recovered. The monk took full credit. You let him. He brings you bread every week now and never questions your use of garlic or vinegar. Still, the danger lies in exclusivity. There are people who refuse treatment entirely, choosing only prayer. You do what you can, leave herbs nearby, offer advice, hope it filters in through a visiting cousin or a well-meaning neighbor. But it gnaws at you, knowing a life might be lost not to disease, but to blind devotion. You sometimes envy the simplicity of their belief. To think that touching a bone, lighting a candle, or walking to a hilltop chapel can realign the body and soul, it must be comforting. Your world is messier, trial and error, blood and sweat, cures that work sometimes, failure that lingers always. But you've also seen the other side. Patients clinging to faith, surviving against all odds. No medicine, no logic, just belief. You can't explain it. Maybe you don't need to. Maybe miracles and medicine don't cancel each other out. Maybe they're two sides of the same coin, spinning endlessly in the hand of someone or something greater. The girl stirs slightly. Her fever hasn't broken, but she takes a sip of your brew, her lips barely parting. The mother gasps. The priest murmurs a prayer of thanks. You say nothing. Just keep feeding her the mixture, slowly, patiently. She's not healed, not yet, but she's still here. As night falls, you leave the chapel. The stars blink overhead. You whisper a silent thanks, not to any saint in particular, but to whatever gave you the sense to blend medicine and miracle, to navigate this uncertain road with grace and caution. Because in the Middle Ages, a good doctor isn't just a healer. You're a mediator between reason and faith, between body and soul. And tonight, you did both. You're halfway through patching up a farmer's mangled thumb gnawed, rather enthusiastically by a horse, when you hear it. The whisk-shunk sound of shears sharpening on stone. You glance across the dusty courtyard, and there he is again, sleeves rolled, apron stained, blades glinting. The local barber surgeon. And he's humming, loudly. There's nothing quite as humbling as realizing the man who trims your beard is also offering amputations at half your rate, and with a loyalty program that includes leeching every 5th visit for free. In medieval Europe, barber surgeons are your odd, chaotic cousins in the world of medicine. They lack your academic background, your Latin phrases, your extensive knowledge of Galenic theory. But they do have one thing in spades: hands-on experience. Lots of it. Bloody, bustling, battlefield-bred experience. And for better or worse, patients often trust the man with the sharper knives. Historians still argue whether barber surgeons should be praised as practical lifesavers or scolded as reckless butchers. In truth, they're both. They were born out of necessity when war created more wounds than scholars could treat. When soldiers needed limbs cut off fast, and priests didn't want the blood on their hands, literally, the barbers stepped in. Their toolkit is a terrifying blend of instruments. Bone saws, scalpels, clamps, and oddly enough, shaving brushes. You once peeked inside one's satchel and found dried herbs stored beside bits of twine, and was that a tooth? You didn't ask. But here's the awkward truth. Sometimes they get results. You recall a time when you were called to assist with a dislocated shoulder. You hesitated, unsure of the best angle, fumbling through pages of anatomical sketches. The barber surgeon, meanwhile, rolled up his sleeves, gripped the patient's arm, and popped on it. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't textbook. But the man could move his arm again. It stung, not the shoulder, the ego. You want to dismiss them, these jack-of-all-trades, but they have a certain medieval swagger you can't ignore. They stitch wounds while gossiping about the mayor. They lance boils between beard trims. They'll yank a tooth and give you dating advice in the same breath. One even paints signs boasting "no infections this month," as if that's a marketing slogan and not a public health miracle. And the public loves them. Nobles might prefer your educated droning in tidy Latin, but peasants? They flock to the barber surgeon. He's affordable, accessible, and rarely judges their hygiene. You, on the other hand, sometimes forget to smile after diagnosing an imbalance of moist heat. You're working on that. There's competition between your professions, sure, but also an unspoken truce. You do the theory. He does the cutting. You explain the humors. He removes the limb. You prescribe a poultice. He slaps it on and holds the patient down. It's an awkward dance, but it works, mostly. You've even referred patients to each other, quietly, tactfully. Perhaps Brother Oswin can help with that toothache. You once suggested to an elderly woman. She nodded, left your clinic, and came back an hour later smiling gummy, but grateful. Still, you wince at some of their methods. Boiling urine to clean tools. Blowing tobacco smoke into wounds. One barber in a neighboring village claimed to cure headaches by drilling into the skull. Just a little. He now runs a candle shop. And yet, you envy one thing, their confidence. Where you hedge your language with maybes and theorizes. They say, lie down, bite this, and I'll fix it. You admire it. You fear it. You occasionally borrow it. Some barber surgeons are trying to professionalize. There's talk of forming guilds, creating standards, even writing their own manuals. The College of Physicians isn't thrilled. You overheard a debate where one physician called them butchers with combs. But you know better. They're not butchers. They're just not you. You once spent a whole evening sharing ale with one of them, Rufus, a wiry man with hands like rope and a voice like gravel. He told stories of battlefield surgeries, of sewing ears back on with thread soaked in wine, of cutting arrows from flesh with nothing but a hot spoon. You listened, wide-eyed, realizing you'd never learned these things from a textbook. At the end of the night, he patted your back and said, "You talk fancy, Doc, but you're all right." You've remembered it ever since. So here you are, wrapping the farmer's hand and glancing at your competitor across the square. He grins, twirls his shears, and calls out, "Need a trim, scholar?" You laugh, raise your hands bloody, bruised, but sure. "Maybe after I finish saving fingers." Because even in your uneasy alliance, one truth remains. You're both needed, both flawed, both doing your best in a world that doesn't always reward effort. You might wear robes, he might wear an apron, but beneath the surface, you both serve the same cause. You just do it with different tools. You stand outside the dusty door of a city clerk's office, heart thudding in your chest. In your satchel is the culmination of years of study well, sort of, and enough coin to make your palms sweat. Today, you're not healing anyone. Today, you're buying your future. Because in the Middle Ages, becoming a licensed doctor is less about passing rigorous examinations and more about knowing the right people, quoting the right texts, and let's be honest, slipping the right bribe into the right hand. Inside, the clerk barely looks up. "Name?" he asks. You give it. He flips through a ledger thicker than your surgical notes and grunts. "Proof of training?" You present a letter from a monastery where you once attended a Lecture 1 lecture. It's stamped with an ornate seal and signed by someone you suspect isn't real. The clerk doesn't care. He just squints, nods, and opens his palm. Historians still argue whether medieval medical licensing was meant to ensure quality or just collect fees. Spoiler alert, it's the fees. There are real exams in some places, mostly oral recitations of Galen or Hippocrates. But with enough coin and a confident smile, you can often sidestep them. One colleague earned his license by diagnosing a bishop with excess thinking. Another bought his from a traveling scribe who also sold protective amulets. You place the coins on the table. The clerk counts them slowly, making a show of checking your paperwork again. Then he produces a sheet of parchment, scribbles your name, adds a wax seal that's still warm from his pocket, and hands it over like a baker passing you a loaf of bread. Congratulations. You're now officially a doctor. You'd feel proud if you weren't so sure that half the other licensed physicians in this city did the exact same thing or worse. Some never studied at all. One particularly bold fellow simply started calling himself Master of Ailments and opened a clinic. He dressed the part, spoke with a vague accent, and charged double the going rate. The guild eventually caught him, but only after he tried to remove a spleen through the back. Still, you have to admit, the license does open doors. Patients treat you with a little more respect. Inns offer discounts. Guards let you through plague checkpoints. Nobles ask your opinion on things they used to wave off. You even get invited to a dinner at the mayor's estate. You try to ignore the fact that the invitation was addressed Dr. Galenus, a name you scribbled once in a fevered attempt to sound more scholarly. But not everyone buys their way in. Some students go the long root years in universities, memorizing Aristotle, dissecting pigs, debating ethics. You admire them. You also know half will never practice, either crushed by debt or kept out by guild politics. You once met a brilliant woman who could identify dozens of illnesses by smell alone. She'd never get licensed. Wrong gender, wrong name, wrong century. The guild system complicates everything. To practice medicine legally in many cities, you need a guild's approval. This means more fees, more signatures, and often more arbitrary rules. You once sat through a meeting where a guild debated whether red shoes were appropriate for a man of medicine. They decided yes, but only on feast days. And then there are the fakes. You've encountered physicians whose only qualifications are confidence and charisma. One offered a tonic made of boiled beetroot and mercury. Another advertised himself as a bone whisperer. They attract crowds, rake in silver, and vanish the moment someone dies. You try to report them, but the system moves slowly, unless, of course, they're stepping on your turf. Then the guild is suddenly very interested. You've learned to walk a strange line. You maintain your license, attend the occasional lecture, and pay your dues. But you also do your real learning elsewhere, in barns and back rooms, from midwives, herbalists, and battle-worn barber surgeons who never cared for parchment. Once, you were called to consult on a case with a freshly licensed doctor from the north. He carried a leather bag with gold fittings, wore fur-lined gloves, and insisted that black bile was responsible for a man's sudden blindness. You suggested the man remove the poultice of mustard and soot from his eyes. Vision returned in hours. The fur-gloved doctor left the city a week later. And still, the system churns on. You play the game because you have to. Patients trust papers. They trust seals and signatures. Even when those seals were applied by a clerk half asleep and thinking about his lunch. You return home, license in hand, unsure whether to frame it or hide it. Instead, you tuck it between the pages of your herbal journal, beside a list of fever remedies and a sketch of a wound you stitched last week. The ink is still smudged from when your hand slipped. That smudge feels more real than the wax on your new parchment, because you know the truth. You became a doctor long before the license said so. You became one the first time a patient looked at you with fear in their eyes, and you didn't flinch. The first time you held a feverish child and felt a pulse racing beneath skin. The first time someone really lived, because of something you did. The license is just paper. What you carry in your mind, in your hands, in your conscience, that's the real qualification. Even if no guild will ever stamp it. You wake with a scratch in your throat, just a little one. Nothing serious. By midday, your head aches, your joints burn, and you've started to shiver despite the layers of wool wrapped around your chest. You ignore it. There are patients to see, wounds to dress, stubborn nobles to pacify. But by nightfall, you can barely stand. You collapse into bed, suddenly aware of an ancient, inescapable truth. The doctor has become the patient. It's one of the grim ironies of your profession. In the Middle Ages, exposure is constant. Protection is laughable, and immunity? That's just a word monks use when they pray over your body after it gives out. You spend your days wading through illness, leaning over the fevers and lesions of the desperate, never quite certain which breath will be the one that infects you. Today, it finally caught up. You once believed you were invincible. All young physicians do. You tie your mask on tightly, bathe in vinegar, hold sprigs of herbs beneath your nose and think, that'll do. But disease doesn't care about masks or confidence or your growing list of half-successful treatments. It slips through gaps in cloth, through open mouths, through the pores of your too tired skin. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians fully understood the risks they took or simply accepted them as part of the job. You know, now that it's both. You never really considered the odds until they turned against you. The fever burns through you for 3 days. You hallucinate a little once you dream you're being bled by a leech the size of a goat, which is equal parts terrifying and oddly comforting. A midwife checks in, pressing a cool cloth to your forehead. She says you'll live. You believe her. Mainly because you're too weak to argue. The problem is, you know too much. You recognize every stage of your own decline. First the chills, then the aching limbs, then the tightness in the chest. You diagnose yourself with at least 3 different diseases, none of them with high survival rates. But eventually, the fever breaks. Slowly, like a fortress under siege, deciding to open the gates. You emerge 4 days later, pale and shaking. The world feels slower, softer. Every breath tastes precious. You understand now, more than ever, what your patients feel when they stare up at you from their straw beds. Vulnerability is no longer theory. It's something you've worn. You return to work cautiously. Some patients gasp when they see you. "We thought you were dead," one whispers. "Not yet," you reply, with a hoarse laugh. Others seem disappointed. They lit candles in your name. You thank them anyway. You start wearing gloves more often. Not always. They're expensive, but when you can. You boil your tools longer. You air out your clinic every morning. You lecture patients, gently, on washing their hands. Some laugh. Others listen. A few even copy you. One night, over a cup of weak wine, you realize something else. Your illness changed your tone. You've grown quieter, more deliberate, less eager to show off, more focused on listening. You ask more questions now. You pause before prescribing. You notice things you once brushed past: fear in the eyes, shaking hands, the way a patient's voice tightens when they talk about home. You visit a colleague, an older doctor who survived plague 3 years ago. He doesn't talk much, just pours you tea and places a hand over yours. Different after, isn't it? He says. You nod. That's all that's needed. Some of your patients ask if you now possess healing magic, as though surviving illness has granted you divine power. You smile and say no, but you do feel changed. Like you've walked through a door and left something behind. You write about the experience in your journal. Not the symptoms, those are already scribbled on dozens of pages, but the fear, the stillness, the clarity that comes when you realize you can't outrun what you treat. You wonder if future doctors will feel the same. If centuries from now, someone with a stethoscope and a mask of their own will sit in a quiet room, reading your words, nodding in recognition. You keep going. There's no other choice. People are still getting sick. The world still groans beneath the weight of disease. But now, you treat with something more than herbs and guesses. You treat with empathy, a kind of understanding that only comes when you've felt the same fever, fought the same fog, heard your own breath falter in the dark. You're not invincible anymore, but you're better for it. You sit alone in your modest clinic, dusk slipping through the windows like a gentle ghost. The world outside hums with distant bells and the shuffle of carts. Inside, your fingers rest on a worn table one you've leaned on during surgeries, scrawled frantic notes upon, and sometimes just clutched when the weight of it all got too heavy. You're tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep cures, but a deeper, older fatigue, the kind that settles into your bones when you've spent a lifetime fighting disease with half a map and a pouch of herbs. And yet, you've survived. You think back to the day you first called yourself a doctor. How proud you were, how foolishly certain that you'd change everything, that your knowledge, your hunger for understanding, would be enough. But the Middle Ages had other plans. You entered a world where illness outpaced cures, where fire devoured learning, and where the people you most wanted to help either feared you, ignored you, or ran to the nearest saint instead. Still you stayed, not out of glory, not for gold, though that would have been nice. But because you couldn't walk away from a cry in the night, or a fevered child, or a mother who looked at you with tears and trust in equal measure. Historians will one day write about the failures of your era, about the bleeding, the bile, the beaked masks, and burned books. They'll laugh at your leeches, shake their heads at your astrology charts, and marvel that anyone survived at all. But you'll know the truth, that buried beneath the superstition and shadow, something vital endured, a spark of curiosity, a quiet, stubborn mercy, a willingness to try again. You remember the patients who thanked you, even when they died later, the midwives who taught you more than your professors, the barber surgeon who slapped your back after a joint reset, the nun who smuggled you a real anatomy drawing and never told a soul. You remember the children who lived, and you hold on to that. Because every time you held a hand during a fever, or stayed to wrap a wound others wouldn't touch, or stitched in silence while a mother prayed over your shoulder, you practiced medicine. Not perfectly, not always wisely, but with heart. And here you are, at the edge of your life, with a shelf of handwritten notes, a cupboard of half-empty jars, and a soul worn thin but proud. You light a candle. The flame flickers. You whisper to it, not a prayer, not tonight, just a promise. That someday, someone will carry this work forward. That healing will become more than guesswork. That doctors will one day have tools you can't even dream of. And that those doctors will know they stand on your tired, ink-stained shoulders. That the future bright, clean, and maybe even merciful started here, in this little room, with you. Let's slow things down now. You've walked through dim, smoky corridors of medieval hospitals. You've stitched, stirred, prayed, and guessed your way through a time that offered little but expected everything. You've seen just how fragile medicine was, and how much it still dared to hope. Let the flicker of the candle fade behind your eyes. Let the sounds of coughing and whispered blessings drift far into the distance, like the tolling of a distant bell on a foggy morning. You've done more than enough for one night. Take a deep breath. In through your nose, hold it and let it go slowly, like the smoke rising from a healing herb bundle. With every breath, feel the weight of bloodletting tools, dusty scrolls, and long-forgotten chants begin to lift off your chest. It's okay now. You can rest. The work of healing never ends. But for now, someone else is watching the stars for signs. Someone else is boiling rosemary in a small pot. Someone else is tracing the lines in a patient's palm and wondering quietly, always quietly, what more they can do. So settle in. Let your body relax into the sheets. Let your thoughts wander, but gently. No more urgent knocks at the door. No more patients waiting. Just you, here, safe. And sleep will come like it always does, when we've done our best and surrendered the rest.